Look, I've noticed a growing problem with the Rift update. Y'all suck. I'm kidding, but am I? That doesn't matter. What matters is that there's only a couple videos out there about Vampire Slayer, and none of them are by me, which means they all automatically suck. So without further ado, let's jump into the guide. Just kidding, there's more ado. Here's a bunch of timestamps to go to if you're looking for a specific part of the guide. Alright, now let's get into the guide, starting by explaining each attack individually. Coagulation is probably the simplest and most straightforward ability of the boss. It basically just drains your health, but as long as you're either damaging the boss constantly or using your healing melon, you'll be fine. Nothing to say here, the boss kinda just jumps around and gives you a split second of breathing room. However, it can be an indication of when certain other attacks are about to happen, which I will get into later. Mania lasts for 22 seconds, and is basically just like a game of Simon Says. Stand in the green section, preferably closer to the boss for tiers 4 and 5, so the Tuinclaws are less likely to knock you off the green. Shoot for the wider, straight sections. Also, make sure to not get too close to the boss on the inner circle, as then he will just push you away, and most likely into the red. It's good to know that the red zone starts out as red concrete, then turns into redstone blocks when the Mania is about to damage you, so make sure you're out of the red zone by then. Tuinclaws is probably your biggest problem when it comes to this boss. He'll launch two claws, one towards you and one in the exact opposite direction. The front claw is unavoidable in most cases, sometimes you can just side strafe it and nothing happens to you. To not take a ton of damage, use your Holy Ice to pretty much nullify the attack, but it's important to know that you still take damage from this because Holy Ice only nullifies 80% of damage, so keep an eye on your health. To know when to use your Holy Ice, listen for this noise. Once you hear this, use your Holy Ice immediately unless there's some special reason. Tuinclaws will happen every 7 seconds, but there's a couple of times where you can be sure a Tuinclaw will or will not spawn. As soon as the boss spawns, you'll have about 7 seconds to damage him as much as possible before you have to worry about his first Tuinclaw. You can also measure this by counting the amount of spectral forms the boss does after you spawn him. As soon as he finishes his second spectral form, he will Tuinclaw. Additionally, as soon as Stonewrath finishes, the boss is guaranteed to Tuinclaw, so be ready for that. Finally, you can loosely measure the Tuinclaws during Mania stages, as they normally happen every other time the green zone changes. The boss will spawn 3 Coagulates, which will steal 1 heart each until you kill them. Then they turn into cadavers on the ground, which will look like skulls. A couple seconds after the boss spawns, he will fly up into the air and create an outline on the ground where he will blow up everything in the area. The strategy is, kill all 3 Coagulates in a close group, then when the boss launches up into the air, run over to the cadavers on the ground and stand there until you hear this sound. This means the boss's explosion area has been locked in, which gives you enough time to get away before the boss explodes to the ground, meaning they cannot respawn into Coagulates. I would make sure to treat this phase as a break, as when the boss is up in the air, you're pretty much safe so long as you make sure you don't die to Coagulation. This is pretty self-explanatory. The boss will display an action on your screen to perform, and you must complete it before the 2-second timer expires. This will include clicking up, clicking down, jumping, and sneaking. Make sure to exaggerate clicking up and down, as sometimes the game thinks you haven't gone all the way up or down yet, so it won't count as you having done the action. Not much to say for this either. The boss will launch a spring of candles that you need to compact by alternating right and left click until it is compacted. If you fail to do this, you are instantly killed. However, the timer for this is more than enough time, so you pretty much can't die to this on its own. Additionally, you can just spam both right and left click at the same time to compact the spring super quickly. Probably the hardest thing to counter, the blood Ichor must be destroyed in 25 seconds or you die. It also makes Coagulation do 0.5 hearts more damage per second, so the sooner you destroy this, the better. The only way to destroy this is by having the vampire launch its Tuinclaws at it to destroy it. We'll cover more specifics later, but for now I want to highlight 2 strategies for killing these. First, and my favorite, is standing directly on top of the Ichor. This basically makes it impossible for the Tuinclaws to miss, as the Tuinclaws will always launch towards you. The other strategy, which in my opinion is less useful in most scenarios, is by standing in line with the Ichor and the boss, even if the Ichor is behind the boss. The way this strategy works when the Ichor is on the other side of the boss is because the Tuinclaw will also launch backwards to destroy it. Now that we've covered every ability individually, it's time to cover how each ability interacts with each other in each boss from tier 1 to tier 5. For Tier 1, I recommend a maxed out Rift Armor setup using pre-Vampire Slayer items, including this armor and these talismans. You should also max out your Enigma Cloak and Monzumenta Pet, as while they're not required for this stage, they will be in the near future. Finally, the pickaxe should be perfectly fine for this boss as a weapon, and a healing melon should be more than enough. Tier 1 starts out with a simple combat phase with no special abilities, and once you get the boss to around 288 health, it enters a Mania phase. Still though, Mania is the only ability the boss uses, making this phase incredibly easy. Finally, the last combat stage is like the first one, but also with Stonewrath. However, you probably won't even have to deal with Stonewrath on account of the boss dying before it can actually do the ability. Tier 1 is basically a joke. As long as you have the gear for it, you're not gonna die. With that said though, Tier 2 is a slightly different story. For gear, you can consider upgrading to an anti-bite scarf and a silver lace karambit, but your setup from the Tier 1 should still work fine, except make sure to get a holy ice by this point, as even though a Tier 2 without one is possible, it's not exactly fun. Tier 2's first combat phase is the first time we see Tuinclaws, so that holy ice will be put to good use. Thankfully, that's the only ability during this phase, and once you get the boss to around 612 health, it'll enter a Mania phase, but it is still just purely Mania, so nothing to worry about there but Coagulation. Finally, the last combat phase is like the Tier 1s, but also with Twinclaws. The boss shouldn't be a struggle either, but once you get into Tier 3, you'll start needing to pay a lot more attention to the mechanics as it introduces a lot more abilities. By Tier 3, you need an anti-bite scarf and a silver lace karambit, and if you're really struggling, you can also get leggings of the Coven. Just make sure to wear a popular color like black, or coordinate with other players for a color. You should also upgrade your melon to juicy. Also, by this point, you need a holy ice and a stake, no two ways about it. The stake is more optional, but you still should get it, as it basically just makes the bosses faster. Tier 3's first combat phase is exactly like Tier 2's, so nothing to say except for watch out for increased damage numbers for Tuinclaws and Coagulation. Once you get the boss to around 1317 health, it'll enter its first Mania phase. That's right, I said first, meaning there's multiple Mania phases, but more on that in a moment. This is the first time during a Mania phase where there's another ability present, Impel. Still though, it should be incredibly easy as long as you make sure to melon a few times during the fight. Once the second combat phase starts, it's exactly the same as the second combat phase of the Tier 2 boss, just once again with higher damage numbers. Then, once the boss gets to around 677 health, the second Mania phase starts. The second Mania phase is also the same as the first one, so there's still nothing new there. But finally, once you get to the third and final combat phase, it's all of the same abilities as the second phase, plus Killer Spring. Now with Killer Spring, your number one priority is to make sure you don't get killed by Twinclaws while compacting it. Thankfully, from what I've seen, the boss always does a Stonewrath at the same time as a Killer Spring for his first spring after Mania, so you still have a period where the boss is in the air and you can freely compact the spring. However, it's still pretty easy to compact the spring even when the boss is on the ground, so only do this if you really struggle. Also, sometimes the particles from the boss's outline for where he will blow up the ground will get in the way of the final stages of the spring, so it can be hard to compact if you do it that way. This can be avoided by having the boss lock in far away from the spring, so that way the candle can still be compacted. Anyways, after the Stonewrath is done and the spring is compacted, the boss should be pretty close to dying, and that'll wrap up the Tier 3. Now before you move on to the Tier 4, I highly recommend getting extremely familiar with the Tier 3's mechanics, as the Tier 4 will test everything you've already learned in a much more intense way. At this point, you need leggings of the Coven and a luscious healing melon, and you should probably upgrade to a silver twist karambit, although a lace one might still get the job done. If you need to, consider upgrading your anti-bite scarf to the mythic version, or getting the vampiric time charm. Anyways, the first combat stage is the same as the Tier 3's, and when the boss gets to around 1729 health, the first Mania phase starts. Now let me tell you, this is where you will believe me when I said you need to learn each mechanic and how they interact with one another. The boss will still do his normal Mania and Impel, but now the boss will also use Twinclaws during this phase as well. Pair that with the fact that they can do knockback, which can knock you out of the green zone, you're gonna have a lot of annoying moments in close calls when you first start trying to kill the boss. What will happen a couple of times during this phase is a Tuinclaw, an Impel order, and a green zone change all at once. If you can't do all of those at once, I would start by completing the Impel, while simultaneously switching to your Holy Ice and using it, then move. Mania normally gives you more than enough time to move, considering the most you'll ever have to move is like 7 blocks. Doing it in this order ensures that the Impel Impel is completed, and then just in case the Tuinclaws knock you into the red section, the Holy Ice will absorb that too. If you want to get even more nitpicky, if you specifically have a jump Impel order with a Mania shift and a Tuinclaws, this technique is very useful, as the boss can knock you out of the zone much easier. Anyways, the second combat phase is like that of the tier 3, except for the addition of Impel. Now thankfully the boss does not use Impel as frequently as he does in the Mania phases as he does in the combat stages, or at least that's what it feels like because you gotta deal with all the other crap. Anyways, the second Mania phase begins at around 1059 health and is like the first one, and the third combat phase is like the tier 3's third combat phase, but also with Impel. However, and please listen to me when I tell you this, you are not ready for the tier 5 yet. You will need to practice this boss a lot and get incredibly familiar with the mechanics, as well as pretty much all the gear available in the Rift at the moment. With that being said though, it's finally time to move on to the tier 5. This boss is difficult. Basically max out your setup at this point with an upgraded Scarf and Lively Sepulture chestplate, along with a Silver Twist Karambit. If you're struggling, which you probably will be, consider getting the Vampiric Dentist Relic. You shouldn't have to buy the dead cat food or use consumables, but if you still can't do the boss, those are really your only other options at this point. You know the boss is hard when the admins literally put a warning in the boss's description, and believe me, they are not lying. You basically can make little to no mistakes the whole run, so let's break it down. Combat Phase 1 is more of the same, except we're finally introduced to our good friend, the Blood Ichor. Now from my experience, the boss will only get to spawn 2 to 3 Blood Ichors within the first combat phase, which at this point during the boss are not that annoying to deal with. Just be careful as they do buff Coagulation, so you'll have to melon a lot more. Speaking of meloning, this is the only boss where you have to melon even when the boss isn't launching Twinclaws to damage you. That's how much damage Coagulation does. This is the last time I'll say it. Keep an incredibly close eye on your health. There's eventually going to be a mod letting you know when you're low on health, but until then, this is what we have to do. Anyways, when the boss gets to around 2,367 health, the first Mania phase starts. Now the first thing you need to know is if you still have a Blood Ichor from the first combat phase, that will still be here, so make sure to take care of that. Other than that though, there isn't much else new here. Just kidding. Sure, there's no new abilities, but even if you fail to complete one Impel, you will take 20 hearts of damage and immediately die. So doing your Impels is absolutely necessary. But once you've completed this phase, the second combat phase starts, this time with Blood Ichors too. Now thankfully, you shouldn't see too many of them on account of the Stonewrath and other abilities sort of interfering with whether they can be activated or not. But once the boss is around 1,783 health, the second Mania phase starts with all of the same abilities as before, except also with Blood Ichors. This is where the method of using the backwards claw I mentioned earlier is best, as during Mania you can't walk wherever you want to, and the boss is also perfectly still, making it easy to deal with the Ichors in this way. Other than that, everything else is the same, and Combat Phase 3 begins, which of course is the same as the Tier 4, but with our good friend the Blood Ichor. Thankfully though, it seems to me that the Killer Spring also interferes with the Blood Ichor spawning in, so you'll hopefully see less of them. Once you get the boss to around 1,196 health, he begins his third Mania stage. That's right, there's a fourth Combat Stage 2 after this too. Thankfully, there's nothing new in the third Mania phase, so just be careful of what I mentioned earlier. Finally, the fourth combat stage starts, and at this point, it's a race to get it to its stake health to finish the boss. Of course, you should still play it safe because the boss will almost always get off a Stonewrath before you kill it, meaning any timers of Blood Ichors and Killer Springs will continue ticking even when you're not doing damage. But finally, when the boss is stakeable, going for the kill, and you've done it. You've experienced pretty much all of the content available to you in the Rift currently. Stupid dancing minigame, I hate you. Now you could also grind motes for Shen's auction and get a couple accessories you're missing, but you've officially experienced all of the actual fun content in the Rift. Give yourself a pat on the back, because you sure do deserve it. But what if you want to keep going? Maybe get some extra quantum books or burger stacks or whatever? Well please, for God's sakes, just do the tier 4 bosses. If you could barely do a tier 5, then you should be able to do a tier 4 every time like me. They give almost equal drops, they're easier, they're faster, there's only a 30 XP difference, which to me does not seem worth it. They're also cheaper too, and even without selling any Slayer drops or melons to the Mote Scrubber, they will almost pay for themselves on their own. And hey, if you really want that ultimate enchantment, which is the only tier 5 exclusive reward, then just max out the RNG meter with tier 4s and then try to kill the tier 5 to get it. That's why as of writing this, I've only done one tier 5 for the Skyblock XP, and then 56 tier 4s. If you're super consistent on killing tier 5s, then go ahead and do them, but otherwise I would stick to tier 4s. Now if you thought all the talk in the above sections was a lot and way too in-depth, you're probably right, but thankfully most of these extra tips are pretty easy to understand. First, and probably the most helpful to those looking to solo the boss, location is very important. On screen now are the best locations I've found to spawn your boss. However, be warned that each of these has a drawback, such as the void in this one, and either too many players or a lack thereof in the others. So it really just depends on the conditions you want to kill your boss. Speaking of too many players, be wary of players running in front of you as you're either holy icing or melaning, or just doing anything involving right clicking, as it will open up their profile, which will most likely lead to you panicking, spam healing, running out of mana, and then promptly dying. To avoid this, either go for a low player area like these ones, or looking down whenever you right click as much as possible, or you can just exit their menu really fast. Additionally, I like to remap my inventory button to a faraway key on my keyboard, as multiple times I've died to the boss when I opened my inventory by accident. A couple general tips include keeping items in the same order on your hotbar so you can memorize hotkeys. Don't worry about the boss timer, as either it will die or you will. Melon every time you're around 6 to 8 hearts in case of an accident. And don't ever use the aspect of the leech, as it is a waste of mana. Speaking of mana, as long as you don't panic or mess up and do something you shouldn't have, you won't run out of mana, so long as you're hitting the boss and have the gear I recommend. Also, some additional gear you'd get include the dead cat food, elixirs from Shifted, the weirder tuba, and hemoglass. However, only the dead cat food is really helpful, as everything else is either too expensive to do every time, or you just simply don't have the mana for it. It's also important to hit the boss, or really anything you can, any chance you get. One thing to know is that while your boss is active, all mobs become passive and idle to you, meaning that during Stonewrath you can attack them for extra mana and health since you can't damage the boss during that period. It's also important to save your holy ice purely for the Tuinclaws, as otherwise you'll be taking a lot of damage and wasting mana. Also, it should go without saying, but make sure to give yourself enough rift time to actually kill your boss, because if you leave in the middle of a boss fight, none of your progress saves, meaning you've just wasted time and motes. Thankfully, your kill progress saves, so what you can do is get one kill away from spawning the boss, and then do something else or leave early. The boss will sometimes randomly heal all of its health back, although this is quite rare. I have no idea why it happens, but thankfully when it does happen, it doesn't set you back any phases, so you don't have to redo a Mania you already did. Finally, if you're looking to farm drops from vampires, always help others with their bosses, as you can still get RNGs from them. So, what did we learn? Probably not much. I'm a pretty shoddy teacher. However, I feel that this video is incredibly thorough. Probably too thorough in most parts, but I wanted to make a guide that I would be proud of and that missed almost nothing. Of course, information in this guide is subject to change and updates, and if any substantial changes are made, I will make a pinned comment highlighting the changes and how they impact the boss. If you're still here, I hope this was useful to you. As of recording this, I'm on the 7th page of my script for this video, which easily makes it my longest video ever. I'm also aware this isn't a typical full-length video, and it's more of a short type of topic, but there was no way I was going to fit all of this into one short, and making like 20 parts felt stupid, so that's why this video's here. Anyways, I'm gonna go to bed, so I'll see you soon.